Now let's talk about analyzing the structure of opera, because opera is a really extensive work. It has many acts, and it can be really daunting if you've never analyzed an opera before. Where do you start, and how do you appropriate the work step by step? So we're going to talk about structure going from macro to micro, right? And you can analyze many things that will help get you there, from the biggest picture down to the smallest details. So let's start first with the characters. You want to do a character analysis and just plot in your mind how many characters are in this opera, how many of them are male, how many of them are female, what are their voice types, and just get that clear in your mind. And also you want to situate where these characters are. Where is the action taking place, right? Are we in Seville? Are we on the moon? Are we in a prison? Where are we? And where do we modulate? Do we go all over the world in this opera, or do we go, basically we're in a location, but we might have act one be outside in a garden, and the second act is inside in the tower, and the third act is in the dungeon, and so on. Where is the action, and where does it move from act to act? And so at the end of the opera, what voyage have we made? Then after we're talking about the characters, let's talk about the intrigue. What happens amongst the characters? What interactions do they have? Are there any transformations that occur within a character thanks, or it's the fault of another character who influences somebody badly or for the good? So that's always interesting too. What is the intrigue, and what is the personal transformation of these characters from the beginning to the end of the opera? Then we're going to go act by act, and we're going to see its topography. And you can plot this in many different ways. So you can consider, for example, the pacing. Do we start andante? Do we start allegro? And what is the heartbeat, let's say, aria by aria? Do we have a general increase in tempo? Is there a sudden increase and then something dramatic happens and the heartbeat of the opera stops with a sudden largo? So you can see what happens act by act and plot it. There's another type that you might be interested in, which is how many characters are on stage at one time. Do we start off with one person, or do we start off with a throng of people? For example, the opening of Don Giovanni has one person on stage. But, in Act 2 of La Bohème, we open and everybody's on stage, right? It's a throng of people, and we have all of our principal singers as well. So that's always interesting to get your head around. Is this an ensemble act, or is it character by character act? And what happens? What's the evolution of that? So this is also very interesting to note, and thanks to our friend the computer, we can actually do some kind of neat topographies, and I'll show you one of them that I've done myself for Don Giovanni. Then we can talk about special large numbers. You always want to see any kind of aria that has more than 3 people. So any quartets, quintets, sextets, choral numbers, dance numbers, anything like that. Let's focus in on that. Finales are also big and intricate. They have many different parts. So start by zeroing in on these large ensemble numbers and pointing them out and seeing where they are, analyzing them, and getting a handle on those. And from there, then you can go downwards increasingly to the trios, the duos, and then the arias. And in that way, you will have gone from a macro study at first, increasingly micro, until you will have analyzed the arias. Now, let's take a look with a very specific example of Don Giovanni, and we will go through the 5 steps that I just talked about, but with a concrete example of an opera that we can all study together. So let's talk about the characters in Don Giovanni first. How many characters do we have, and who are they, right? We have 5 men and 3 women. We have Don Giovanni, Leporello, the Commendatore. We have Mazzetto and Don Ottavio. Then we have the 3 women. We have Don Anna, Don Elvira, and Zerlina, right? So that's important. And what kind of voices are we talking about? we have, for example, two basses. One is a dramatic bass and the other is a buffo bass. What are the differences? This is a key time to read up a little bit about Fach. The Fach system is a German system of voice classification. You don't necessarily have to get into the Feinheiten or the real details of all of the stratospheres, but you should be aware of the different types. And is a lyric soprano the same thing as a dramatic soprano? What is a soubrette? What about a contralto? Can you have it? What does spinto mean? And so on. So take the moment and look up the Fach system and get acquainted with it so that you can understand what the difference is between all these voice types and what kind of sound you're looking for each one of these characters. Now let's talk about the intrigue in Don Giovanni. What happens? And what are the relationships of all of these characters? Well, as you know, we have some couples in Don Giovanni, and then we have some singletons. So the singletons can be considered Leporello, because he's not in a romantic couple, the Commendatore, and then we can consider, and is Donna Elvira in a couple? We can talk about that. There are some certain couples. There's Don Anna and Don Ottavio, and there's Zerlina and Mazzetto. Those are sure. Then there are people who are maybe with a kind of different kind of couple. For example, Donna Elvira, she was in a couple with Don Giovanni, and it's important for the action because that's why she's here. It's like the ghost of her relationship with Don Giovanni is haunting her, and she comes back, kind of like Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Past. This is Donna Elvira coming to reckon with Don Giovanni and also to plead for him. This is an interesting thing about Don Giovanni. He's the only one who is simultaneously in couples and eternally single. So that's also interesting to look at when you're in an opera and you're trying to understand what the couples are doing and who is in a couple, not in a couple, wants to be in a couple, etc. This is like the bread and butter of opera, intrigue. And Don Giovanni is the Ubermensch. So he has three relationships simultaneously, one from the past, Donna Elvira, one from the recent present, which is Don Anna. It's not a relationship, but there is a connection. There was something that happened. And that's how the opera opens. And then we have Zerlina, which is later on in the action. And this too is not a relationship, and yet it's some kind of interaction. He's coming into contact with many women in a romantic or a non-friendly platonic way. And yet he is eternally single, as Leporello says in his Mille Lettre aria, the catalog aria. There are other couples that you can consider which are not romantic couples, but people who are connected to somebody else in a very faithful way. The Commendatore, for example, is very faithful to his daughter. Leporello is very faithful to Don Giovanni. So these are alternate couples that can be considered within the intrigue of a plot. Then within each couple, each romantic couple, let's say, you can have faithful people and you can have wavering people. So some are still faithful but might have a moment of doubt, whereas the other partner is strict and true to their partner. For example, Don Ottavio and Don Anna. Don Ottavio, we know, is faithful, pure, 100%. He's with Donna Anna. However, Donna Anna, we're not quite sure, and it depends on how you would like to see the relationship between her and Don Giovanni. What's sure is he's very unsettling to her, and she wavers a bit. Now, is it because she secretly wants to be with him, or is it only because of the horribleness that happened to her in the beginning of the opera? It is not clear. So it depends on the stage director and what vision he or she may have. But this is a couple which is not the same, on the same level in terms of power and also faithfulness. There's another thing to consider, specifically in Don Giovanni, if we're talking about faithfulness and infidelity. Is Don Giovanni supremely unfaithful? We would like to say yes. The catalog aria tells us all about it, and we see three witnesses who talk about, what a horrible person he is and that you're not faithful at all. On the other hand, isn't he supremely faithful to himself? He is himself. And even at the end of the opera, when the commendatore says, you must repent, Don Giovanni never wavers. And he says, no, I will be myself, and I am stuck in my ways, and I will be like this forever. And then he is condemned. These are also things you want to consider, and that makes your comprehension of the work even deeper and more complex. And then you can see how that translates to the music and what the composer thought of these characters as well. Now let's talk about the topography, which I decided to do for Don Giovanni Act 1. I'd like to see how many people are coming in and out of scenes, and where do the big numbers come in. So I can show you on this PowerPoint page that I made up. At a glance, you can see where the quartet is, and then you can see where the finale is. You can also see where number 5 is, the choral scene, and it just gives you at a glance the topography of the different characters coming in and out, and where it's a little bit heavier and where it becomes lighter. I also included the recitative. You might want to do only the arias and treat the recits differently. The recitativo secco might be treated differently from the accompanied recits, and we'll do a special section on accompanied recits a little bit later. But this is just an idea of you to be able to plot and be able to see really clearly with one page the overview of one aspect of an act in the opera. And then, of course, you can also do that, add the acts together, and then have a topography for the whole opera. It's also the process of doing this which is very interesting for the mind, because the more you juggle with different aspects of a work, the more fully and completely you know it. And I remember when I was studying piano with Byron Janis, there were always the taking apart of the different hands, the different aspects within a piece of music, and to fully comprehend and appropriate each part of the accompaniment or the melody or the harmony or whatever was going on, so that if they are each very seriously and fully defined within your mind, then when you put it together, it's a very rich composition and universe that you have created, because you've taken the time to see the details. And that's what we want from an opera performance. We want it to be rich and varied, this kind of tapestry of humanity and music. A word now about the special large numbers, specifically in Don Giovanni, as we're going from the macro to the micro. So remember, in Act 1, we have the introduction, which starts out with one person, but then the trio comes in and it ends up being more than 3 people on stage. So you could consider the introduction as part of this large ensemble. Then you have number 5, the choral scene. And then you have the quartet. And of course, the finale with all of its different parts. And the same way that you might learn an instrumental piece, which is difficult in a certain section, you divide and conquer. So if the finale looks too busy and too dense, and you just don't understand how you can put all of the finale in your mind, start by noticing the biggest chunks. Let's say the finale is made up of 5 different parts. And then start with part 1 and go more micro from there. And then part 2. Isolate it and refine it. 3, 4, 5. Then you put 1 and 2 together, and then 3, 4 together, and then 5, and then you put everybody together. And if you do that kind of divide and conquer process, such things as the finale become bite-sizable, and you can ingest it more easily. So that's in Act 1, right? We have those large numbers identified, and then in Act 2 of Don Giovanni, we have the sextet, and of course the finale as well, which is a grandiose finale. And up to you and the stage director if you're going to do the happy ending, or if you let Don Giovanni just burn in hell and that's the end of the opera. So in any case, always start with identifying the large numbers, and then you go into the smaller trios, duos, and arias. When we're considering the arias and the smaller numbers within an opera, we want to be investigative journalists. We want to ask these 5 questions. Who, what, where, when, why? Then you can actually ask a sixth one, which is how. But these are all very interesting because what we always want to do is remember the drama and the meaning and intention of these characters that compel them to sing in a special moment, which is not just a crowd scene or giving some general impression. These characters, when they're singing by themselves or in a couple or small committee, we're talking about emotion most of the time. And we're talking about psychological states. And we're talking about also the influence of characters upon the one who's singing. So we have to be very aware of the motivation of characters coming into an aria. If there is some kind of change within the aria, is there a reaction that happens and then new emotions that emerge? And then at the end of the aria, what has happened? Has there been a transformation, or has it just been a constat? Has it just been a recounting of emotions, but there has been no transformation? I was sad in the beginning and I'm sad at the end. So this is something that we have to be aware of dramatically, and when considering the personalities and the characters before we get into a musical analysis, which of course you know how to do because we're all conductors here and we know how to do musical analysis. But we have to get the drama into the musical analysis as well to see where we're coming from, why we start, and why we end, and where we end up. Sanford Meisner is a really interesting teacher of drama, and you might be interested to look at some of his books because most musicians have not taken theater or acting classes, and so this part of opera might be completely new to some of you. It certainly was to me, and I loved getting more interested and more in touch with the dramatic aspect of it and being compelled to action. You shouldn't just open your mouth and sing. You should feel the need to say and to sing what you need to as a character because of what has happened to you, and you need to be in touch with that. So we as conductors can help the singers to be in touch if we ourselves understand that motivation and that process.